Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go! While I did press charges on my mother for stalking me and trying to frame me as a drug dealer, I didn't want to spend much time in court because that meant being near her. So the events I'm about to describe are half from me and half from my dad. They probably aren't very accurate. It was 5 years ago, so please don't savage me if anything sounds off. It's something I've mostly tried to put behind me. To start off with, my dad actually didn't know that my crazy mother had taken a flight to my estate to stalk me. She claimed to him that she was just gonna take a small vacation away from everyone for her own mental health, and never said where she was going. And my poor dad didn't know what she was about to do, or he would have warned me. My mother then spent several days secretly following me and my girlfriend around with her smartphone. She used a spare key we kept hidden inside of a fake rock to get into the house we were living in at the time. She then photographed everything she could. Then after she returned home, my dad said she looked really smug about something. He described it as a kind of look someone has when they think they have won. And she seemed unusually happy and giddy until police came and arrested her on Christmas. Dad said she was bawling her eyes out and saying she didn't do anything wrong, as she was being carted out by the cops. The evidence against her was clear. All of the photos were found on her phone, and my dad quickly realized what she'd done. The call my mother made to claim I was selling drugs, she even made from her own smartphone. The call was recorded and was very much traced back to her phone quite easily. When my mother was confronted with the evidence, my dad said she just started crying and begging. And when she refused to get up from the table, the police had to move her. Dad said she just totally went limp and refused to cooperate. No one bailed her out of jail either. She had to use her own money to get herself out. Dad said she wanted to call me to beg. But I guess in a rare moment of clarity, she figured out there was no way in hell I'd bail her out after what she did. So she spent a while locked up before finally using her own money to get out. She didn't try to run. In fact, she firmly believed herself to be justified in what she'd done, and felt like she could swag a judge to her point of view. Her lawyer advised her to just plead guilty, so she fired them and said she'd represent herself. Well, that went about as well as you can imagine. She was in court faster than I thought. My girlfriend and I had to fly over to testify against my mother, but I only stayed as long as they needed me, and I was on the first flight I could get back. But while I was there, my mother seemed to stare at me almost constantly. The stares ranged from her creepy pleading look to absolute rage. When my mother took the stand, she gave a speech about why she believed she was right. I needed to be taught a lesson for refusing to come home, and for putting some girl before her, because she should have been the only woman I'd ever need. She also tried to keep staring at me the entire time she was making this speech, but the judge repeatedly told her to not do that. I left before the sentencing. The judge believed my mother to be mentally unwell, but when he stated this, she went off on him that she was completely sane. Of course, that just made her look more crazy. She said she was just a mother looking out for her son, and did what she had to do to teach me a lesson. My dad spoke up and said if she really was looking out for me, she wouldn't have tried to make her own son into her second husband, or frame me for stuff I didn't do just for refusing her. That made her go off on him, and guards had to keep them apart. The judge was originally going to be more lenient on my mother, but decided she needed some real time behind bars and sentenced her to 2 years in prison with 3 years probation. When she was sentenced, my mother went full toddler and had a tantrum of pounding her fists and crying like a baby. She had to be carried out of the courtroom because she refused to cooperate again. My dad described the next 2 years without her there as being absolute bliss, and made up his mind that he'd be ready to divorce her as soon as she was out. And I mean giving her the papers on the very day she came home. And that was the same day he left that house for good. He owns an Airstream trailer and parked it at a friend's house. From there, he spent months fighting my crazy mother in a divorce. And that's when more crazy stuff about her came out. My dad eventually won and moved to my state with his trailer as soon as he could. Aside from a few rare phone calls from her, I've not associated with my mother again. And neither has my dad. He spent some time just living as a retired man on the coast, but then decided to get a simple part-time job in a fish cannery because he was bored. He says it pays a bill, and he's made a lot of friends. He's happy, and I'm happy he's happy. I visit him on the weekends when I can. My mother, though, I've not spoken a word to her in 2 years. Any number she ever used to call me with after court was blocked. I am done with her. Edit, forgot to mention, when I took the stand against my mother, I spilled my guts on all of the creepy stuff she did to me. All the stuff from my first post came out in. I had to make myself stop. Everyone but my mother in the courtroom was openly disgusted. And my mother just started ugly crying the moment all eyes were on her. The part where I told everyone she called my girlfriend an interloping witch to some imaginary special bond she perceived us having really struck a nerve as I became furious just speaking of it. My mother defended herself and tried to say we did have that borderline incestuous bond, but I stated that was all in her head and always was. That made her have a breakdown and court had to be ended for the day soon after that. I wasn't needed there anymore and flew home with my girlfriend that very night. Before we start, you need to know that the Karen of this story is pretty much my mother, my entitled mother. Karen's boyfriend committed some fraud and needs a lawyer for their upcoming court hearing. Karen doesn't work, so she relies on her boyfriend to provide for living expenses. Karen gets some offers by mail from several different lawyers and she calls them all for a quote and picks the cheapest one from the lot. Karen calls me and says she needs $1,000 now and $2,000 later. I ask her to clarify and she says $1,000 is for the lawyer and $1,800 or $2,000 is for the fee for the community service program the lawyer said they will get in lieu of jail time. It also seems that $2,000 can be paid over time in installments. I know how much money Karen's boyfriend makes, and it's very little, so I tell them I will only give them the $1,000 if they prove they first applied for a public defender, state-provided lawyer for those with low income. Karen immediately calls the public defender's office and says, "I called and the lady was very nice. She asked for my information and I told her. And she said not to bother coming in for an interview because we make too much money. I asked her for proof to show you and she said there isn't any." This is ringing some alert bells in my head because the site clearly says you need to come in for an in-person interview and bring documentation for all your expenses and household size that they will take into consideration. I'm pretty sure she's lying about the conversation, so I tell her to just go for an in-person appointment anyway. Now it's Sunday and Karen says to her second child, "Your father went for the in-person interview today and he was denied. He lost an hour of wages at work because of the time he had to take out of his day to go to this interview. And he got denied anyway. I told you it was a waste of time." Her second child, who goes by Blue, presses her for more details, asking, "What reason did they give for rejecting you? How did you get an appointment on Sunday even though they are closed on weekends?" And she makes it pretty obvious the whole story was a fabrication. They never went to an appointment. I am getting fed up. She's obviously not going to the appointment unless someone holds her hand and takes her there. Fortunately, Karen's third child, Green, has a lot of free time, so I cash out $1,000 and Green kindly drives about 3 hours to Karen's house. I tell Karen she's only getting the money from Green if they go to the appointment with her as a witness. He takes her boyfriend to the appointment and surprise, they are immediately approved because he makes so little money. Green drives back 1 hour to my house and gives me my $1,000 cash back, less gas money. So she has a lawyer now and doesn't need the $1,000, but she expects me to give it to her anyway, so she can put it in the investment account and make interest off of it. This is second-hand from my father and some words or phrases may be mistranslated. The background. Back during the 1997 Asian financial crisis, Malaysia was hit pretty hard, especially the small independent banks. The Prime Minister at the time passed a bill to save the banking economy by having all the larger corporate banks buy out the smaller, independent banks. At the same time, he made the One Malaysia Home Loan policy. Under this, all larger banks that bought out the smaller, independent banks must send an acknowledgement letter to the home loaners of their original bank stating the home loan change and must receive an acknowledgement from their new loaners, be it a signature, physical, or digital. The story. My dad never liked how banks can legally rob people. For people like him who work the daily grind, having to pay the bank what is essentially 2 houses worth in interest payments over 2 or 3 decades is just plain wrong in his eyes. He strives to one day screw a bank over like how they screw their customers. A contract. When my dad bought our family's first house, he got a loan from a small bank called DC Bank. All is well until a few years later the 1997 financial crisis hit. As the small banks were bought out by the larger banks, many home loan received acknowledgement papers on their new home loan payment plan and policies by their new banks. My dad, for whatever reason, never received this. He only knew that his original bank was bought over by the RHB Bank Corporation and that he's now unofficially their customer. My dad was frugal with his money and, God bless him, financially literate. He knew that if he made a full settlement against his principal loan, he could avoid paying 30 years worth of interest installments. Sometime in 2007, he went to an RHB Bank branch nearby to make a full settlement, and this is how it went down. The employer tells him, "I'm sorry sir, even if you made a full settlement, you would still need to continue making payments for the interest." That tells him, "What do you mean? I have a home loan contract under DCP that states I can make a full settlement without paying for additional interests." "True, but since you've acknowledged and signed under RHB, I've never received the acknowledgement papers. I never signed any papers from your bank, and all I have here is a DCP bank contract." "Sir, under the One Malaysia Home Loan..." "Well, you have to send acknowledgement letters about the loan transfer." "Yes, I know. What I want now is for you, RHB Bank, to produce my signature of me acknowledging the new loan policy for RHB. As of now, my paper with DCP is still valid until you produce my signature." Cue 1 hour of the employer and her colleagues scrambling around their files and databases trying to find an acknowledgement from my dad about their loan contract. At this point, the manager of the bank had called my dad into his office to discuss this problem. It basically had gone from civil to a shouting match that can be heard in the neighboring food stalls. My dad couldn't remember most of what was said, but the end of it was what he could still clearly remember, and to his son, it was probably one hell of a conversation in there. The manager tells him, "I'm sorry, Mr. Muhammad, but you still need to make the interest payments, regardless of whether you make a full settlement." That tells him, "Alright, I understand. I'll just have to take this up to Bank Negara, National Bank of Malaysia. Let them help you find that signature of mine." My dad had the bank manager now. Rather risking a potential $1 million lawsuit and possibly losing his job, he excused himself to make a few phone calls to upper management, which took about half an hour. After said phone calls were done, the manager approached my dad and agreed to the full settlement without the additional interest installments. To add salt to the wound, my dad requested that they have his housing grant ready within a week, to which they delivered. All in all, my dad managed to secure himself a house, a housing grant, and in the process screwed RHB Bank of what is equal to $60,000 worth of interest payments, which to a middle-class Malaysian in 2007 is a retirement fund. In college, my 2 friends and I decided to find a place together off campus. We found a beautiful 3-bedroom house with surprisingly affordable rent. The basement of the house was listed as a separate apartment, but as it had a separate entrance and the indoor stairwell had been blocked off, we weren't worried. The thermostat was upstairs. Then a demon neighbor moved in. From upstairs, we could hear everything. This adult woman would call her mother and scream at her to pay for her cell phone bills and give her grocery money, aka Taco Bell and cheap tequila. She would scream at whatever guy she was sleeping with to bring her meth, and one day she brought home 3 puppies to scream at too. We were terrified of this woman, and the noise was hell. Also, we've been idiotic enough to sign a lease stating we were responsible for all utilities, period. Meaning we were now financing her gas, water, and electric. But with only 2 months left on a lease, we thought we could just ride it out. But then she started smoking. Constantly. According to the landlord, she'd quit for good when she signed the lease. But for good only lasted 2 days. Since it was winter, the heat was running nearly 24/7, and the smoke was wafting up from the vents. Our apartment and all our belongings began to reek with smoke. We contacted the landlord because we'd signed for a bloody non-smoking apartment. He told us we lived in a state where you could technically call an apartment non-smoking even if it shared ventilation with a smoking apartment. Screw you leasing laws. At this point, my 2 roommates were heading out for a 2-week vacation. They were online students while I was residential, leaving me alone in the apartment with a demon smoker in the basement. I couldn't sleep or eat because my idiotic stomach decided to react to all the secondhand smoke by aching and cramping constantly. After 3 days, I was a little insane. I made a plan. I checked the forecast, lows in the 20s all week. I borrowed a friend's ultra-insulated sleeping bag, and I bought one of those ski masks with holes for your eyes and mouth. I got out my stocking cap, my silk-long underwear, my woolen socks, and my down parka. I bought tea, hot cocoa, and ramen, and prepared to live off a diet of hot liquids. Turned off the heat. Day 1. She's screaming at her mother for forcing her to move into this frozen apartment. Day 2. She's screaming at her boyfriend, the meth dealer, because he won't let her move in with him. Day 3. She's screaming at the landlord about how she's freezing. Day 4. The landlord is at my door and I greet him in full ski mask, parka, stocking cap array, looking like I'm heading out to rob Santa Claus at the North Pole. He asks me if I don't find it a little chilly in the house. I replied that I'd found all the cigarette smoke a little warm. Day 5. She's screaming about the jerks upstairs to anyone who will listen, and I'm sitting upstairs clutching my car keys and my pepper spray with 911 typed into my phone. She finally decides she is leaving and moving in with Greg, even though he just got out for stabbing Travis and he lives in that creepy house in the woods with all those biting dogs. Day 6. She's gone. I silently bless Greg. Moral of the story, there is a bloody reason the rent seems too good to be true. P.S. For those wondering, I did have a friend who worked plumbing stop by to give me some advice about how low I could go before I burst the water pipes to hell and back.
And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching and see you next time.